أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل يأمرهم بالمعروف وينهاهم عن المنكر ويحل لهم الطيبات ويحرم عليهم الخبائث ويضع عنهم إصرهم وأغلال التي كانت عليهم فالذين آمنوا به وعزروه ونصروه واتبعوا النور الذي أنزل معه أولئك هم المفلحون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We continue on in our series discussing the decolonization of the Muslim mind. And in the previous few discussions, we have spoken about the world and the way it is today, why the world is the way it is today. And we have spoken about a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, who says, أعرف الناس بالزمان من لم يتعجب من أحداثه, that the person who understands the time in which he lives in will never be surprised by it, never be overcome by it. Because if they analyze, reflect deeply on the circumstances of the world today, why it is the way it is, if an event takes place, if something happens, we would understand why it has happened the way it has happened. And for us to be able to understand why 1.6 billion Muslims, 1/4 of the world, has by and large lost its ability to champion its own beliefs, has become so crippled by other forces, why is this the case? And we need to be able to understand why the world is the way it is, for us to understand why the Muslim today is so ineffective against the rest of the world. And we stated that the world today, the way in which it is primarily a product of the Enlightenment period. Primarily the idea of placing human rationality at the fore of human thought, rather than revelation. And as we push revelation and God out of the equation of the world, and you and I begin to create our own rationality in place of that, human beings can now decide what is moral and immoral. Human beings can decide the way in which the world should be governed. And ultimately, this is the reason why we have the world the way it is today. From there, we spoke about secularism and this idea of separation of church and state, and how this creates duality within the human being. There is a space for God, and there is a space for other than God. There's a time and space where I am religious, God-conscious, muttaqi, and then the rest of the time, when I step out of that space, I'm no longer governed by what God wants. I'm governed by what my desires are. I'm governed by whatever others' desires are. And then yesterday we spoke about nationalism, that as we began to remove ourselves from a world that is governed by God, we now have a different identity, a non-God related identity. And people wanted to create these countries in order to create these identities. The world we live in today is what is known as the Westphalian order, where states can now create their own countries, their own spaces to decide how they wish to be governed. As a result of this, Muslims have also adopted this way. No longer do we have an ummah where all Muslims are governed under one law. We now have dozens of Muslim countries, each championing their own needs, each thinking very introvertly about their own desires, and therefore they put the country ahead of Islam, the country's needs ahead of mankind's needs. And this is a very un-Islamic way of seeing the world. But Muslims are championing this. Muslims are championing their national pride, which in effect leaves them away from the religion of Islam, which champions humanity's needs. Having understood this, and we discussed this at some length yesterday, we go into our topic today, which allows us to see the effect further of a country seeking to protect its own. Now, we stated the country and the world now shifting God out of the equation and creating its own desires in the equation. This would affect certain areas or certain fields. For example, education. For example, military. For example, economy. For example, all these different areas are now affected by, instead of God governing their thought process, human beings and their own ideas govern the way these things occur. This evening, what we want to talk about is the effect of economy, corporations, and advertising on the Muslim individual and the collective Muslim psyche. Because the world and the Muslim world has adopted a secular approach to living, it also follows a suit that it would also follow the type of living that the secular approach begins to promote. If we no longer need God to be able to govern the way in which we live, then what is the primary way in which you and I live? The world primarily lives on the function of economy. The way in which the world lives is not based upon education. We don't seek to have education governing our lives. Most people learn for a period of 16 or 18 or 20 years, and then they're done with it. Most people don't live for God. Most people have taken God and placed it in a certain place. But the thing that overriding governs this world and the way in which states interact, the way in which people interact, the way in which people live, is through economy. Because you and I need to survive. We need to have a house. We need to put bread on the table. We need to have shelter above ourselves. And so, countries, the primary way in which they look after themselves is through making sure they have a maintained economy. The way in which people look after themselves is having a maintained economy. Now, one of the things we said very importantly about the Enlightenment period was their question of creating perpetual peace. They wanted to find out, how can we make sure that we don't consistently go to war with each other? Which is a very noble question. And we asked in the previous discussion, where is this question within our own texts? Do we have books? Do we have recourse to answering this question about how Islam creates perpetual peace between people? We highlighted the methodology of Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, that he removed arbitrary boundaries between people and said, you are one ummah, learn to work for the sake of one another. Now, when the Enlightenment posed this question, how do we create perpetual peace between people, between states, between different ideologies, they tried a number of ways in which to create this perpetual peace. The first way was basically called international law. If you noticed, within the world today, we have something called international law, and this is supposed to govern states in the way in which states worked. For example, when America and Britain and other countries illegally invaded into Afghanistan and into Iraq and occupied the country so that they could take their resources and place governments over them so that they could have control of these lands, This, of course, was an outcry because they broke international law. There was no consensus amongst international states. They did not approach the United Nations and make a case to be able to invade and go to war. So here we know that there is something called international law. Where did this start from? One of the champions of international law was by the name of Hugo Grotius and other people when they came together and decided, how can we create a law that states have to adhere to make sure that states don't do things and do things in accordance with international norms? For example, one of the queries that they put in question early on in this 16th, 17th, 18th century period was, how do we deem humanitarian intervention? For example, whenever something happens in the world, you will always hear people say, intervene for the sake of humanity. When you see the invasion that took place 5 years ago in Syria, and Qatar and Saudi and Pakistan and other forces decided to just fund hundreds and thousands of terrorists to enter and flock into Syria, people said to Britain and America and their governments, they said, there is a need now. There's so much devastation in Syria. Have a humanitarian intervention and remove Bashar al-Assad. Or in Libya, there is such a state of crisis. Enter in through humanitarian intervention and remove, and so on and so forth. Where did this term come from? The same way international law was created in this period, the concept of international or humanitarian intervention was also created in this period. If we're going to have wars, well, you can't intervene, you can't enter into another state's sovereignty unless it's for a purpose. So what did they create? The term humanitarian intervention. I can enter into another country because I want to protect other human beings from what's happening. Now, of course, there is time and place for humanitarian intervention, but today it is wholly misused for the purpose of invasion and occupation. That being said, during this period, 16th, 17th, 18th century, they began to design this concept of international law for the purpose of creating laws to state that nations, countries couldn't arbitrarily act on their own volition. They would have to live up to certain norms within the world. This was the first. The second was, not only did they try to create international law, they also placed restrictions on the way in which states would act with each other. So they said, how do we create perpetual peace? A second way they tried to create was, they said if states were in business with each other, then states would not want to risk war because it would collapse their economies. If I am Britain and you are France, yes, we can create international regulation to stop us fighting. But a better way for us to stop fighting is that you and I have trade agreements with each other. Because I'm importing and exporting so much between France, there's no way I would want to go to war with France because ultimately my economy would collapse. These were the two ways in which they tried to stop perpetual war or create perpetual peace. One may ask and say, well, how does Islam view creating perpetual peace? Islam says the only way to remove perpetual war and create perpetual peace amongst people is education. Learn to stop hating the other person. Educate yourself about how other human beings live, what their practices are, why they practice the way they practice. And when we learn to educate and remove enmity from our hearts, I'll begin to respect you as a human being, and this is how we will create perpetual peace. Not through regulation of law and not through economy, through learning to love one another as human beings ought to be loved. In any case, al-muhim, what happened was, through this notion of let's create economy between each other, in this period, they created what we call today free market capitalism. They said to themselves, well, if we have more trade with more countries and with more people, the more trade we have with other types of people, the better it is for all of these nations, because we are more likely not to go to war with each other. If I have trade with you, and I have trade with you, and I have trade with you, and I have trade with you, then we're more likely not to want to go to war with each other, because we all have different groups of trade agreements with each other. This, of course, is not a means to have perpetual peace, because seeking what the other person has out of greed is a reason as to why people go to war. If you think about the invasions on Afghanistan, on Iraq, what's happening in Syria, what happened in Libya, very little of this was done because human beings or certain individuals cared about other human beings. They wanted to take over control of these countries, break the countries down, have contracts in place to rebuild these countries, and that would perpetuate their own economies. And so, economy is not a way to guarantee perpetual peace amongst people. In any case, when this happened, and we had lots of trade between countries, between peoples, we found that this concept of free market capitalism came into place, where they said, so long as we are making money, this is what is best. Our goal is to make as much money as possible, and in response, we will put everything aside so long as we are able to make money. Because if people are making money, people are happy. And so long as we begin to write law for the purpose of making as much money as possible, then people will be happy, people will not fight, everybody is happy making as much money as possible. What do? Well, we should have survival of the fittest. Whatever corporations there are, whatever different organizations there are, so long as they try to make money, as a result, whichever corporations have the best form, have the best ways of making money, these will flourish. And of course, the ones that cannot make as much money, they will fall by the wayside, they will be gobbled up within capitalism. And so as a result, the concept of money being at the center of humanity's needs was placed. And you had various different theorists talking about this, and various different ideologies that created this concept. Today, the world is exactly the same. It has based itself on free market capitalism. The market dictates what is correct. The market decides how much someone is worth. The market decides the way in which we should govern our own way of living. Now, of course, this has great effects upon the Muslim. Think about one country. Just think about, for example, Dubai. Dubai, where was it 30 years ago? Where was it 40 years ago? If you've ever seen pictures of Dubai in the sand 30 or 40 years ago, it was just desert, more or less. Compare that to the way it is today. Why is it so plastic? Why has the Middle East, Muslims, taken on this notion that the most important thing is making money to the exclusion of everything else? Because they have adopted this notion of free market capitalism. Money comes first. Your ability to make money is what is most important. It's not that making money isn't important in Islam. Sayyidah Khadija alayhi salam was the richest woman in Arabia. How we make money and what we do with money is what is important. And because the world places making money at the head and at the centrality of what is important in the world today, this is what the rest of the world has adopted through those countries trying to compete with each other, and through these people thinking that capitalism is the most important thing in the world. Now, I want to just show 2 or 3 aspects of how this has affected the world and how it's affected the Muslim mind, and how the Muslims by and large have adopted this notion that making money is the most important thing in the world, to the exclusion of even a rival Islamic system to be able to offer some sort of contrast or comparison to the way in which the world lives today. To set the tone, I want to give 1 or 2 examples of recent history or present history in the way in which capitalism and corporations have all the power in the world to be able to make as much money as possible, no matter the impact upon human lives and no matter the impact upon society. I will take just 2 or 3 corporations and give very well-known examples of what has taken place in recent years and decades to demonstrate the way in which capitalism works. There is an incident, or was an incident, that took place in 1993. And this was one of the saddest incidents that I've ever come across in my research on capitalism and corporations. You may all know of a US car manufacturer by the name of GM Motors, one of the most famous companies in the world. GM Motors was involved in the largest lawsuit, the largest personal lawsuit in the history of this world, and had to pay out $4.5 billion to 6 plaintiffs based on a case that took place in 1993. Christmas night, 1993, December 25th, a family, a mother and 4 children and 1 friend went to a midnight mass to a church to celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ alayhi salam. On their way back, as they pulled up to a red light, a car behind them, who was being driven by a drunk driver, went into the back of that car. The car exploded and burnt the 6 people inside the car, leaving part of them, kids, permanently disfigured, and 1 child who was so badly burnt had to have their arm amputated. Why did this happen? Well, of course, the drunk driver hit into the back of the car. When the plaintiffs sued GM Motors in order to find out what happened and why this had happened, of course, the lawyers had access to all the material to investigate how GM Motors made their cars and why they decided to make the cars the way in which they made them. One internal document that was created and reviewed by the board of GM Motors was the following. If you know anything about basic design of car, there is a fuel tank. The fuel tank is not allowed to be at the back of the car, because if you hit the fuel tank at the back, it would explode. The fuel tank, by law, has to be placed closer to the middle of the car so that it's furthest away from the impact of another car. Number 2, it has to be plated so that it's guarded with something extra, like a piece of steel, so that if it's hit, it doesn't explode. Yes? So it needs to be in the middle of the car, and it needs to be plated so that it cannot be easily destroyable or destructible. Internal documents showed that GM Motors decided not to place that piece of steel surrounding the fuel tank. Why? For what reason? Because if they didn't, they would save $1.90 per car. Now, think about how many cars GM Motors produce in a year, in a decade, and obviously how many they sell. And so although it sounds very little, but if you can save $1.90 per car when you end up selling 1 million cars to 300 million Americans, or you export 100 million cars globally, if you save $1.91 per car, obviously it ends up being hundreds of millions of dollars that you have made in profit just by not placing one piece of steel around that fuel system, around where the fuel is kept. And so they didn't do it, and as a result, when that family of 5 and the 6th child in the car were hit by that drunk driver, the fuel tank exploded, burning all 6 of them and injuring so badly the children. Hence, they sued and got $4.5 billion in compensation. Why did GM not take to consideration the safety of its drivers and the people that would buy its vehicles? Simply, capitalism. Capitalism and making money was more important than the safety of human lives. This is the way across the board. And you will see, whether it's the food that we are given today, whether it's the drinks that we are given today, or the clothes that we are given today, capitalism puts ahead of human welfare making money. And the Muslim has adopted and bought into these companies that have these cooperative measures to be able to just make money. Those corporations that make food, McDonald's. We are not eating food. It's not food. You're eating God knows what's in there. You know, there's a YouTube clip, and I advise all of you to take time to watch this. Really, please, I beg you, watch this YouTube clip. If you don't do anything else tonight, just go home and type into YouTube, McDonald's molten copper. There's a clip on YouTube where they take a Big Mac, and you know molten copper. Can you imagine the heat of molten copper? They pour molten copper onto a Big Mac. And you'll see that the Big Mac, the bun, whatever you call that thing, and the meat, whatever you call that thing packed with cardboard and sawdust and those chemicals, the molten copper doesn't burn through the bread or the meat. Now, yes, part of the reasoning is the fats and the way in which the fats are levied and pushes off but the chemicals and the way in which this food is put together. You will see that they do all these social media tests. They put this food out in the open, and after a year they come back to the Big Mac and it hasn't even begun to dissolve. Even the bacteria can't break this food down. But parents give their children all of these things to eat on a regular basis. They will feed them McDonald's and they'll feed them this junk. And then when their children don't grow up spiritual, they wonder, why aren't their kids praying salah? You fed your child for 20 years McDonald's. What did you think they were going to turn out as? And then we give our kids Coke and Pepsi and all of these things and these sugars. And what do you think is going to happen to our children? When you feed them these things, that's part and parcel. The most famous saying in the West is, you are what you eat. But capitalism, selling to our kids and selling to Muslims, we begin to adopt it and adopt it and adopt it. You know, another incident that took place, and these are all recorded, and if you want the evidences, you want me to show you the things that I talk about, you want me to give you the links to books and to researches, you're very welcome to take them. Nike. Let's all give Nike free advertising by buying their clothes, and Nike, they make, this one is most absurd. Nike, they have sweatshops around the world. One of the sweatshops that was open until recently was in South America. And an American who was responsible for import and export at the governmental level went to go visit one of these Nike sweatshops in South America. He said, as I got there was no sign of this being Nike. There was no billboard saying Nike. However, the building was a building that was just covered with barbed wire, so you couldn't get in and workers couldn't get out. He interviewed the workers there, and amongst the things that they were told is the following. The workers who work are mainly or only women, and they only employ under 25s. Women are not allowed breaks, and they have to work a 12 to 14-hour shift per day. They are not allowed breaks. They are not allowed to drink water, because if they drink water, they will want to use the bathroom, and hence they will have to take a break.
Every month, every woman who works in that sweatshop making these clothes for Nike, they get tested to see whether they are pregnant. And if they are pregnant, they are on the spot fired for their pregnancy. There are 15 different stations that a Nike t-shirt has to go through, right? From getting the cloth, to sizing the cloth, to cutting the cloth, to putting the embroidery on, to packaging, to sending to the United States of America. In order to get that t-shirt sold in the United States of America, they sell every Nike t-shirt for $29.99 US. But the person making that t-shirt gets 2 cents. These are the circumstances that people who make for Nike have to undergo. And Muslims buy these clothes and then champion these clothes for themselves, because we are completely colonized into a capitalistic world, not thinking about the effects of what this happens, or the reality of the effects of the choices that you and I make. You know, we talked about this on the first night, and we gave a statistic, and we said that every person in this room, by virtue of the common things that we buy, the clothes that we buy, the chocolates that we buy, the food that we buy, every one of us in this room has 300 slaves working for them. 300 slaves, of which the majority are women and children. But we don't know, because we just buy and we purchase and we buy and we purchase without thinking about these things and the effects that they have upon the rest of the world, because it is a global capitalistic society. What's even funnier is when Muslims go after the clothes that are made by gay, famous homosexual people. So they buy Versace and they buy Dolce & Gabbana, and then they're championing what are openly homosexual people, and they're buying clothes in order to openly promote homosexual lifestyle. How do we get like this? How does the Muslim world get like this? Without even thinking about what they're doing. That we would buy products to celebrate openly gay stylists. Don't believe me? Go and research the lifestyles of Gianni Versace and Dolce & Gabbana. Go and research, just read. It is all there. But this is where the Muslim has become. Hundreds of millions of us plowing money into these particular areas. Now, what's funny is that this isn't just something that affects the Muslims, this affects the Shia greatly as well. So for example, you know, we will laugh at the Wahhabis. When we walk in, we go into Mecca. As you drive into Mecca, one of the first things you will see is not the Kaaba, is you will see the golden M, the golden arches of McDonald's. And then we go into Masjid al-Haram, and around Masjid al-Haram is all of these shops, all of these huge Western corporations selling us this poison that we put into whilst we go on Hajj and whilst we go on Ziyarah. And then we point at the Wahhabis and say, look how much they have fallen to the hands of America. And then the Shia goes on Ziyarah to Najaf and Karbala and begins to walk from Najaf to Karbala in the Ziyarah of Arba'iniyya, and sees that in Karbala and in Najaf, Coca-Cola is being sold. The product that actually gives towards the illegal and illegitimate state of Israel, where the fatwa of our marajit say it is haram to be able to give to the illegal and illegitimate state of Israel. But in the city of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and the city of Hussein ibn Ali, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, we are serving Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and Fanta and Dr. Pepper. And Shias, they're going on a spiritual journey to Karbala. And they're sitting there funding the illegal state of Israel, killing themselves, getting cancer from these drinks. Now you could say I'm completely wrong, and what's he talking about, and why is he bringing these things up? Or you could reflect for a minute and just think about how colonized the Muslim world has become. How colonized the Shia world has come. That in the city of Marja, where the fatwa exists, millions of cans of Coke are being bought and drunk in order to fund the enemy of Islam today. If I can't give a better example of the extent of capitalism eating up the Muslim in the Shia world, I don't know what else there is. I don't know what else there is. And if it can't make us question the way in which Muslim countries and Muslims and Shia live, I don't know what else I have to say. I have nothing else to say. And we haven't even got on to having an Islamic economy, a true something that we can offer the world to move away from capitalism with, which inshallah we'll go through tomorrow. And this evening, just for this reflection, this is what I ask from us to think about. That the world today is all about money and making money. Islam considers money as important for the purpose of need to live and for the purpose of creating goodness. When we are buying what we are buying, to what extent do we think about what we buy and why we buy it? If we are being advertised to by these corporations, by and large, one can say it is probably something negative. And it is a good standard to be able to think about and check as to whether it's something that we should be buying, giving to our kids. It is very interesting that we look at the rest of the world and we say, why is the world the way it is? And then we ask, why is Islam the way Islam is today? Why do we have 1.6 billion people in such a situation where Islam is ridiculed, mocked, destroyed, killed? People are butchering each other. We have no izzah, no honor in Islam today. And the answer is very simple. Because the majority of the Muslims live exactly the same lifestyle as the rest of the world. Externally we are different, we have said. Externally we are different. We pray, we recite Du'a al-Iftitah, we recite a Juz' al-Quran, we cry of Hussein ibn Ali. But what we put into our system, by and large, is no different to what the rest of the world puts into its own system. And this is something that we have to reflect on. Where we choose to give our money, the corporations, and the reality of how corporations are only there to make money from you and I. Inshallah, we will reflect upon this tonight. Tomorrow we will continue talking about economy and talking about the way in which Islam offers an alternate economy and the way in which you and I may want to adopt a slightly different lifestyle from the one in which we are living today. Inshallah, this has given us something to think about. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. وصلي يا ربي على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Please raise your hands and join each other in dua. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the appearance of the awaited Savior, to allow us to be alongside Him at all times in our life and in our death, if we are to pass away from this world before His coming, to raise us from our graves so that we may partake in the victory of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. We ask you, Ya Allah, there are many people around the world going through such desperate times, those people in a state of war, oppression, poverty, disease and disaster. Ya Allah, grant them all safety, security and victory for the sake of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. We ask you, Ya Allah, help us to fast better, understand the Quran better, and help us to understand the religion of Islam better. And in the final moments of our life, we die in the love of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May I ask you to conclude with a loud salawat in honor of the Imam of our time, Imam al-Hujjah, Ajjalallahu ta'ala Faraj al-Sharif.